So, graffiti and poetry, they're not two words that I've ever really heard uttered in the same sentence before. Probably like most people, when I think of graffiti, I think what I've been exposed to, which is generally thoughtless and meaningless scribbles on a public space. But can graffiti also be deep and meaningful and beautiful? Well, today I would like to find out. So, hello and welcome to Creativity Uncovered. My name is Abby Gatling, and I'm on a journey to uncover how everyday people find inspiration, get inventive, and open their imagination. Basically, I want to find out how people come across creative solutions and how they use them at home, at work, at play, and everything in between. And the goal for my podcast is that by the end of it, you'll be armed with a whole suite of tried and tested ways to summon creativity the next time that you need it. And today I'm very excited to be speaking with Leslie Reed, who is a graffiti poet and a visual artist. Welcome.
Oh, thank you so much, Abby, for having me as a guest on your podcast. I'm delighted to meet you. I'm in Berkeley, California, and you're all the way in Australia. This is a wonderful opportunity.
I know. I love these international conversations, and the podcast has certainly created these opportunities to speak with lovely, interesting people from across the globe. So thank you so much for joining me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I totally hear you. You know, graffiti, I never thought too much of it for a long time. But I do have to say, once I was in Turin, Italy, doing part of a project, and there was some very interesting, very thoughtful graffiti. It was a television eating someone's brain. And I thought, okay, that somebody's thinking about like what's going on with the television. So I think when I was in Europe, I started to see some beautiful isolated pieces of graffiti.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, you've come across these little sparks of interesting
Right.
graffiti. Was that
Yes.
the thing that started you on your journey to become a graffiti poet, or what was your journey like there before, way back before any of this
Way
started?
back. Um, well, I did see like big, beautiful, just fishbone skeletons on high buildings in Brussels, old high buildings, snuck in places here and there. And I think that just hid in the back of my mind that occasionally graffiti can be beautiful. And my graffiti is very different than that. But I just wanted to mention listening to your podcast, and I think when I started to access my creativity consciously, that led into my reviving my art and becoming a poet. I had a set of cups that I'd bought at IKEA, which is a big Northern Hemisphere store. I bought blue ones and white ones, and I had to have them in white, blue order. And then I noticed more than that, I would look at one cup in particular when I went to make a cup of tea, and I started to allow myself to take that cup because there was something was speaking from within. So being present enough to notice what I'm looking at. And often, if I'm about to leave like my keys behind, part of me will look at them and see them. And if I don't listen, I'll walk out the door and I'll be like, darn, they were right there. I was looking at them. So there's a way that my intuition and my creativity speak to me sometimes through how I look. But the way I got to graffiti poetry was interesting. So my younger daughter she moved for the first time to England with her father when he and I divorced. He's British, and she moved over there, and she was having a hard time. It was a tough adjustment for her. She was going to finish her pre-college studies there, what we would call high school. And so I decided I would go over. And right before I left, I read an article about an American poet called Ruth Stern. And Ruth Stern talked about her poetic process and her inspiration process. And Ruth grew up on a farm in Virginia. And she would be out working on the farm and she would hear a poem come across the landscape.
Wow.
And she would run back to her house, get to her room, grab a pen and write down what she was hearing. But sometimes she would get there so late because she'd been really far away on the farm that she would stick her pen in the air and she would pull the poem to the page. And then she'd look later and it was written down word for word backwards. So I read this before I went to England and I was like, wow, that is so cool. So when I moved to England for the first time in my life, I lived on the beach. I was 50 meters, as the Brits and you Australians say, from the water. But it was along the White Cliffs that rim much of England. And there was a very strong wind coming across the channel, the English Channel. And the waves were loud and they were crashing or they were receding. And there was noise. There was so much noise that when I would walk on this beach, which is for me a very sense alive kind of experience, I couldn't even hear myself think because it was loud, it was moving, it was beautiful. And then I started to hear these lines in my mind and I thought, that's not how I think. I'm not even hearing my thoughts. So the reason I started to graffiti was those chalk cliffs break down and leave chunks of chalk on the beach. And the Brits built these beautiful seawalls so that you could walk along the cliffs. And people are always graffitiing on them. Kids graffiti, smiley faces, there's like dirty graffiti, there's whatever. And so I was like, okay, clearly you can write on those. And this is going to be erasable, right? So I grabbed chalk, I went over and I started writing down what I was hearing. And they started out kind of feisty, which is the stage I was in post-divorce. And they evolved over time. But there was one day that I went to the beach. I've brought my book. I showed it to you already. So this is the only way to retain the record of the poems I was writing on the seawall was to take photographs with my phone. And so it became a sort of visual and poetic arts process. And there was a day that I went down to the beach and I knew that I would start to get a feeling a poem was going to come. And so I go down to the beach and there I was at the beach and I got to the wall and I reached up. I'm kind of petite, but I reached up toward the top of the wall and began to think about a poem. And this man leaned down from up here and he was much older than I was. Graffiti. And I was like, poetry. He goes, a bit old for that, aren't you? And so I was like, I was really taken aback. And that's when I decided it was graffiti poetry. And so I wrote a poem right there. And it was a simple one and it was part of the evolution. But so that's when it began to be called graffiti poetry, because this man was so rough about the idea that I was writing. He had no idea what I was going to put, right? And my poetry has continued. I write on a fence here now in Berkeley, California. It took me a while to find enough natural environment and quiet, but I started to walk in Berkeley and I found some public right-of-way stairs with a fence, and I started in the trees that just leaned over and the nature that just envelops it to hear poetry again. So I now have a poetry fence and I have over 70 poems it's like an installation because I write with Sharpie markers, these things. I write with permanent marker now. And it's been a really interesting process because I'm just writing what I hear. And on occasion, I've discovered that a line will be inverted or a couple of words will be inverted, but basically I don't edit what comes. It's just raw. And I think of each one as a gift.
Wow.
So this muse is just present for me.
And it's inspired by nature. So you're hearing this stuff coming crashing through the waves and with this intense sea air blasting you. Mm-hmm. And this is a muse, you're saying?
I feel that it's a muse, that it's it's part of me, it's part of nature. nature is part of the divine. It is a gift. It's not a possession of mine, and it gives me gifts. And people have come to find that my poetry is very soothing to them during the COVID shutdowns. Apparently people were reading my poetry, and I met one woman. She said, you helped me get through the shutdown. And all I was doing was writing something that came through me that often synthesized what I was going through. And so it's one of the things that really soothes me, is to just allow myself into that natural environment and to just get quiet and allow. Sometimes it's the looking. If I'm in my house, what's the looking? What's drawing me? What looks fun? But with poetry, it's, what am I hearing? And I often am like having to rush to the fence because I'm starting to hear 2 or 3 lines, and I'm like, oh, quick, can I get there fast enough and write it down?
Oh, right. Okay. So it is like very much nature based, but you don't have to necessarily be in that space to be inspired or to hear your muse.
Most of the time I am, but sometimes I'm on the way there. And then I do have a whole series of journal poems that, poems will just come to me here in my home. And those have a different tenor to them. They're clearly the same voice. And, because the muse speaks through me, there's a play of words, and there's a love of language that is similar. But I just feel like they're sort of cataclysmic sometimes when they come. It's like, oh, I can't believe that just came. And I'd be happy to read a poem to you if you would like. I could read you a very, very simple one.
Yes.
So I was hiking in a different area of nature, and there was this beautiful green painted surface. And suddenly I could hear this. Used to be, I am seen, therefore I am. Used to be, but in becoming, I am just me, and thus I am seen.
Wow.
And to me, it really speaks to the victory of a woman not having to feel like her value comes from how she impresses a room with her physical presence, with her intellect, with her humor, but to see myself from the inside out, after having been raised in these cultures that say, you're really valuable because of how you look and how you dress and what you can present and what you can offer. But so that's the kind of thing that the muse gives me, is this synthesis moment of, it used to be that I felt like I existed when people saw me, but now I see the world from the inside out.
Yeah. Wow. So it sounds like it's almost like a therapeutic act
It is.
through doing this.
It is. It's truly that. It's truly that.
Yeah. Well, I'm interested in the graffiti side of things because,
Cool.
you said that in the beginning you're writing in this chalk, this flint, and you're writing on these sea walls, and they were at the mercy of the elements. They'd be washed away at the next sign of rain.
Right.
And now you're moving on to using Sharpies, which is obviously much more permanent. What is that shift? Does that change how you feel? Do you get pushback from people now that you're writing in a more permanent way?
Such a good question. The first time I heard the muse when I got back here, and it took me almost a year to find enough quiet and really isolated nature, because Berkeley is a small city nestled around a big university. So there's something about the dictation that is important to my process. So I just had like a regular old pen with me in my pocket or something. And so I just wrote the first one down on a fence, and I thought, but I noticed there was a little bit of graffiti already there, little sweet kind of painted images. And eventually I met the owner of the fence, and he is really happy to have it there. He's like, I hear people talking about it. I think people are making podcasts about your poetry. This is like, it's impactful. It is more stressful, though, sometimes, because one, I'm dyslexic, so the spelling can be nutty, and two, I can't really edit it. When it was on a seawall, if I knew that if in a dire situation or in the moment when I felt like that wasn't exactly what I heard, I could get some wet sand and I could erase, put it back up. So it feels more intense. And one woman, I give these poetry tours now. See, that's one of the benefits, is that they're there. And people really like to hear me read them. So I'll take them to the top of the stairs and we walk down the fence and I read poem after poem. Poems about my cousin having passed away, poems about how I feel about the trees, poems about a hawk that landed, the way I've responded to the light. They're all there. And they've become this like installation. And it's very different than what happened in England, where I remember one time I went down and the winter storms were so high that there was no seawall to be seen. I was, you could only look down about 2 feet from the top. It was water. And then other times this sand would erode away so that I couldn't reach even near the top of the wall when I was writing. It was very ephemeral. And so here, it's kind of strange to have that transition to permanent, but it's really quite well appreciated, actually. And today I went up there, and a really short poem that I'd written on the 4th of July, someone wrote next to it, "I heart you, Leslie Reed," next to my poem. And people write things like, "I love your Leslie, I love your brain." People write comments there, not all the time, but often I'll be writing and someone will say, "Oh, you're the poet? Oh, I love your poetry." And then there's some people who are like totally disinterested and they just gone by, right? But
yeah, wow. So you've got this like notoriety in your area, and having this, the people who are writing stuff, actually you don't know them, do you?
No, I don't. But one time I did meet this guy. I'd not been to my poetry fence in a while because I'd had a knee injury. And so I got back there and I was like, "Oh, it's still here." And he goes, "Yeah." And he goes, "I love this poetry." And I'm like, "You like my poetry?" He said, "Yeah, I came back. I was here a year ago and saw this and had this incredible moment with my son where he was playing and I noticed the poetry and what was written really like gave me this sense of peace." And so he was like, "I'm the one who wrote this, Leslie. I love your brain."
That's nice. I like it.
Sweet.
Yeah. So you mentioned like you moved back from the UK back to the US, and it took you quite some time to find that sense of quiet before you could start to hear your auditory muse again.
Right.
How did that make you feel when you weren't tapping into that?
Well, it's a little awkward because I did wonder if the poetry had gone away. But the funny thing is that when I was in England, the muse met me at the beach and gave me these poems, right? But then she would follow me into my apartment and say, "Okay, put that brown paper you just bought for making, for wrapping packages up on the wall, and you're going to draw this." And I started to get orders for visual art. So I think that a lot of the time when I first got back, I was creating visual pieces. And it's almost like there's a queue at the door. Like sometimes I'm doing poetry and sometimes I'm doing visual art. It's pretty rare that I am like doing both in the same day or in the same week. And so it felt okay, but I did have a little niggling feeling of like, boy, this is just too gritty and urban for me. The city just felt like too gritty and urban for me. And then I took this long walk and found those stairs with that fence. And so it was, it came back. And there had been moments in England where it would be weeks between willingness to go to the beach because they are a process. They help me process deep situations going on in my life. And so I think sometimes I would be like, "I don't want to go down to the beach because then I'm going to have to feel my way through something intense." So
yeah. Yeah. I suppose that it does sound like a pretty intense sort of action that you have to be in the right space mentally and be emotionally be like, "I'm actually ready to do this now."
It's true because the thing is that they're all they have I read them to the students at UC Berkeley. I go to the poetry club, and one of them said, this is like a whole performance art thing that you're doing. And I was like, really? And I was like, yeah, that's true, because it does feel I have to rally to do it, because I'm leaving it behind, whether it was in chalk and was going to get washed off by the next tide or the next rain, or it's on the fence and I'm just not going to see it for a while unless I go right there. There's still a feeling of like, I'm aware people are going to read this, right? And sometimes they're very poignant, and sometimes they're rarely funny. They're really much more about the depth of my heart. And
do you feel very exposed by doing that? Is that quite a vulnerable process?
It's awfully hard to explain. In some ways I don't. It's a part of my character is that I need to externalize my expression of self. But then maybe what I need to do is be quiet sometimes in between. Like, I'm okay that I did that, but like I may not say anything right now, and then I'll go. Then I can rise to it again.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So, I mean, it sounds like really specific places that are inspiring you and that you want to leave your poetry, that the
Yeah.
seawalls in the UK and now this particular fence in San Fran. Are you, is there a point where you'll feel like you'll need to move to another new space? Or do you think that this new space that you have by the stairs, that's enough to keep you going for now?
Well, I've kind of filled it up.
Yeah, that was my next thing was going, now it's
Yeah,
pen and Sharpie. You have a limited canvas.
I do. So sometimes when I'm hiking, I'll write on another fence or another surface, but the fence is kind of long and runs down the hill. And at this point, I have to sand off, like all of the smooth boards are gone. And now it's all the new rough ones. So it's quite possible I'll need another place to do this, but and a friend staked out another fence, and it's just up a little farther. But the thing is, it's more among houses than trees. So it's like, yes, there's one big redwood right there, and that's really nice. But it needs to be, you know, enveloping. The nature needs to be enveloping for me to hear it. So I think I'm probably on the hunt in a rather slow and casual way. And one thing I did was somebody decided to write some really icky, crass graffiti onto the fence. And most of the time, it's not a big deal if someone writes on there. But it was just gross. And the fence owner and I agreed it was not necessary. And so I painted a big angel on there. And that's really fun. So I have this big blue-winged Archangel Michael that I painted on the fence. And so there are other parts of the fence that I could use that same base color, that same white gray, and I could paint over. But the thing is that you have to put a surface on there at night and go write your poem in the next day, because otherwise the local graffiti artists will put something on there.
Oh yeah, lovely
But I don't know.
fretful. Very
Yeah,
dangerous.
yeah, you don't want to just like prepare the territory for somebody else.
Yeah.
So yeah.
It is interesting to me, like your choice of location for that. It is within nature, but you're not actually writing on nature. You're still writing on a man-made structure. Do you ever think about that, or like have you thought about that selection?
Well, I never would really want to carve anything into a tree, you know. And I haven't really thought about that selection, but the thing is that the poetry comes fast enough that I need something that's vaguely like paper. It has to be able to be taken down fairly quickly, which is more or less a man-made process, is going to give me that kind of surface.
Yeah. Do you think you'd have the same sort of feeling or cathartic expression if you were using canvas or some other medium?
Mm. I don't know. I really think there's something about the sort of raw challenge of being in nature and writing on the beach where people could watch me, and rarely are people there when I write on the fence, but I'm writing with Sharpie, so there's a tension.
Yeah.
And I think that that feeds the process, that gets me in a way out of myself and into just this flow with the muse, with this experience. And so the canvas for me, I like take a really long time to finish a lot of my paintings. I go back and I go back, and I just feel as though um, writing on a canvas would get me in that mode of like editing and reconsidering, and it wouldn't be the same raw expression.
Yeah, definitely. You mentioned your book before, and
Yeah.
I understand, taking photos when it is like an impermanent piece when you're writing on the seawall.
Right.
Why are you taking photos of it when you're writing it in Sharpie?
Well, because they're to some degree impermanent, and I want to be able to share the poetry farther than just those who are going to see it on the fence. And I, being a visual artist, I really enjoy taking the images. Sometimes there's vine that's growing through, and there's a beautiful leaf that's settled there, or the color of that green wall that I showed you with the "Used to Be" poem. So it's it became in England a process of visual art as well. And some of the moments were just so gorgeous. The way I was able to photograph the light against the wall, and so I think that that became part of how I do the poetry. I wish I could find it. There was one I wrote that was like in French and English. Yeah, I love this one. You see how the seawall, like you could see the light on the seawall. It was so beautiful.
Yeah.
And that one's about being a muse. And
Yeah.
if you want, I can read it to you.
Yes, please do. For the people who are listening to this and not watching this, this is a beautiful photo of a grey and raw concrete seawall, which is just stunning. So please do read it.
Sure. Okay. Je muse, j'amuse, je m'amuse. En fait, je suis la fée, la muse amusée. I muse, I amuse, I amuse myself. In fact, I am the fairy, the bemused muse. So it's kind of fun just playing with, this repetition of one word, one root.
Yeah,
But
word.
that, I think that photo with it was simple colors, simple and gorgeous. And so I wanted to capture the same thing here in Berkeley. And I didn't really know how well they'd last, and they've lasted pretty well. But I have put deck spray over them, deck shellac spray over them.
Oh, right. Okay.
Although, yeah, so they'd survive the rains. We got some rains in the winter, so.
So tell me about the book. So you in the beginning you started taking photos to
Right.
you know be able to remember these things, and you
Yeah.
said this is about sharing it wider.
Mhm.
How did the idea of actually compiling your photos into a book come about?
Um, when I got back to California, I met a photographer who I showed the photographs of my poetry to, and he said, "Oh, you could make a book." He was big on making photo books, and he said, just put the photo of the poem here, and then type it on the other page. And I was like, and it took a really long time. And then actually, a really good friend who I met in England passed away, and I felt that in tribute to her, I wanted to put the book together. Um,
Mm.
that was like this. She was super supportive of my poetry. Like she liked it from the feisty beginning ones where it was like, you know, before I really kind of hit this sweet and deeply soulful voice, she was like cheering me on. And so I guess it was like a deal with my friend Taz. Was I'm gonna make a book, and I had the premise of it all set up by this friend here.
Wonderful. And how can people get a copy of this book?
Well, you can reach me on Instagram. It's at Leslie underscore Reed, REED underscore art. And you can message me there. They are self-printed, they're self-published and they're printed in small batches. So right now they're $50 a copy, and that makes them precious books and a little bit of an investment, but they're really quite gorgeous. And so I've sold like 15 or 20 of them, which feels like a big deal to me.
Yeah, congratulations. That is so good. And I'll pop the your links to your socials and everything like that in the show notes so people can reach out to you and follow your journey. Thank you so much for sharing this interesting story and educating me more on graffiti poetry. It's been absolutely wonderful.
Oh, you're so welcome. I think I'm the graffiti poet as far as I can tell. But yes, it was really delightful to get to spend time with you, Abby. Thank you
Yeah.
very much for having me as a guest.
You're so welcome. And, maybe you're going to be starting a revolution and people are going to start using this as their self-expression. Who knows? Who knows? But there, thank you so much. And I also want to say thank you to everyone who's tuned in to this episode of Creativity Uncovered today. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And if you did, please do share it with a friend, family member, because sharing is caring, and getting this podcast out to the world is such a cool thing. And as always, please do get in touch if this has inspired you or has helped you some in your creativity, because I always love to hear those stories. So until next time, take care. If you've made it this far, a huge thank you for your support and tuning into today's episode. Creativity Uncovered has been lovingly recorded on the land of the Cubby Cubby people, and we pay our respect to elders past, present, and emerging. This podcast has been produced by my amazing team here at Crisp Communications, and the music you just heard was composed by James Gatling. If you liked this episode, please do share it around and help us on our mission to unlock more creativity in this world. You can also hit subscribe so you don't miss out on any new episode releases.